Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. and our continuing study of 1968. As we continue to explore a little more deeply some of the social and cultural movement on the home front in 1968, in this lecture I'll talk briefly about some of the cults and counter-religions that were popular at that time in the country. In the atmosphere of liberalism, freedom, and mind-altering drugs of the 60s, many Americans, and those around the world, took to experimenting with non-traditional religions, cults, and movements. By 1968, a few of these had begun to take hold and arrived on the national consciousness, in ways both good and bad. As one example, Charles Manson came to California in 1967. He settled in Berkeley and managed to woo a young librarian named Mary Brunner, along with a number of other young women. Manson preached to the group about starting a race war. The group began traveling the country in the midst of the hippie era, gathering recruits to what he called the family. In August of 1968, he established a commune in Topaganda Canyon and another in Death Valley. Manson was profoundly influenced by the Beatles' White Album, especially the song Helter Skelter, which he imagined as ushering in his race war. The worst of Manson and the family's behavior came the next year, in 1969, as the hippie movement spiraled into a drug-induced haze. On July 1st, 1969, Manson shot and killed Bernard Crow, a black man believed to be a member of the Black Panther Party, hoping this killing would bring on the race war he craved. Then, the family murdered Gary Hinman, a wealthy man whom they tried initially to extort to get money to support their movement. When he refused to give them money, they stabbed and killed him, drawing panther paws in his blood, hoping to place blame on the Black Panthers, again sparking a race war. Most horrific were the murders of Roman Polanski, Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, Jay Sebring, and 3 others on August 9th, followed the next day by the savage stabbing and murder of 2 more victims, scrawling "Death to Pigs" and "Helter Skelter" in blood on the walls. Manson and his co-conspirators were arrested, and he lived out the rest of his days in jail. But the family represents the most heinous side of the various cults and pseudo-religions that proliferated in 1968. Another religion popular in the United States in 1968 was Zen Buddhism, emphasizing peace and serenity. The legend of Zen states, Buddha was growing old. He called an important meeting among his disciples and sat silently for a long time. The Buddha arose, came forward on the flower-decked platform, looked over his audience of disciples and monks, then picked up a flower, which he raised to the level of his eyes. Then, without uttering a word, he returned to his seat. His followers looked at each other in bewilderment, not understanding the meaning of his silence. Only the venerable Mahaskaipa serenely smiled at the master. And the master smiled back at him and wordlessly bequeathed to him the spiritual meaning of his wordless sermon. Zen Buddhism swept through China and Japan and arrived in the United States in the early 1960s. In 1968, the Tassajara was built, the first Buddhist monastery in the United States, in California. Zen Buddhists engaged in meditation, believing, quote, since the earth is constantly moving, and our thoughts and bodies are constantly changing in a process of fluctuation, then what we really are can only be experienced in each moment. Zen Buddhists were peaceful and serene, typically appearing with shaved heads and wearing all the same types of robes. They were often seen in American cities and streets in 1968. Buddhists had some attraction to Americans of many callings. One of the most famous in 1968 was the Catholic monk Thomas Merton, pictured here, who visited the Dalai Lama in 1968 and died in December 1968 in Bangkok. While Catholic, Merton was drawn to the peace, silence, and reflection of Buddhism, and his writings and speeches emphasized tolerance and many Buddhist messages. In death, he became a symbol of enlightenment for many Americans of various faiths. Another cult created in 1968 was the Children of God, founded by David Berg in Huntington Beach, California. Berg recruited young adults from the hippie movement. He had been a Christian pastor, and his preachings incorporated a core of Christian beliefs. Like other cults, the Children of God incorporated apocalyptic elements and interpreted various events as signs of the Second Coming or the end of the world. Berg was also distinctly anti-government, anti-corporatism, and anti-established churches. He urged a return to the kind of church described in the Bible and a communal lifestyle of sharing, a common theme among cults of the 1960s. However, Berg added a controversial element, which he called the law of love. His church advocated adult-child sexual contact and allowed open marriages. Eventually, Berg was forced to close the church under accusations of incest and child abuse, but it has been revived under a variety of different names over the years. Another cult or pseudo-religion of the late 1960s were the Moonies, as they were called, followers of the Korean religious leader Sun Myung Moon. He founded the Unification Church, based on the book Divine Principle. The religion incorporated biblical and Asian beliefs, belief in a universal God, the creation of a kingdom of heaven on earth, the salvation of all, and a belief that the second coming of Christ would be a man born in Korea in the 20th century. The Moonies took this theology one step further, calling Moon himself the Messiah. Moon claimed that when he was 15 years old, Jesus appeared to him and asked him to complete the work he had not finished. Moon was imprisoned for a time by the communist regime in North Korea, but after the Korean War he was freed and began his preaching. Moon incorporated an intense anti-communist message in his teachings, which led him to find a following in the United States. The church supported Richard Nixon and became so prominent during the Watergate hearings in 1974 that Nixon thanked the church and its members for their support. For a time in the 60s and 70s, Moonies could be seen in many airports, handing out flowers and candy in exchange for donations. In 1968, it's estimated that there were only a few hundred Moonies in the United States, as their numbers grew into the thousands in the 1970s. With the release of several books written by former members and by sociologists and others studying the movement from the outside, the Unification Church came to be identified as almost synonymous with a cult, as members virtually abandoned all individual identity in their allegiance to Moon, who arranged marriages and intimate details of members' lives, such as when and how they could have sex. Despite these and other concerns, the Moonies have maintained a small foothold in the American religious landscape even to this day. A final movement achieving prominence in 1968 was Transcendental Meditation, especially as preached by the Indian spiritual leader, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. The Maharishi gained particular notoriety when he was visited by a number of celebrities and rock musicians, such as the Beach Boys, and especially the Beatles, who stayed with him in India for several weeks in 1968. The Maharishi was born in the 1910s in British India, into a high-ranking caste traditionally engaging in writing and thinking. In the 1930s and 40s, he spent years under the tutelage of Swami Brahmananda Saraswati, who taught him the secrets of deep meditation. He then spent 2 years living in isolation in the Himalayas, before returning to India in the 1950s, when he began touring the nation and spreading his teachings about transcendental meditation. In 1959, he made his first international tour, and by the early 1960s he was touring almost constantly, visiting every corner of the world. He traveled with almost no possessions, and unlike many other perceived cult leaders, he seemed to have no agenda. As he once said, "I had one thing in mind, that I know something which is useful to every man." And as one article in a Hawaii newspaper wrote during his 1959 visit, quote, "He has no money. He asks for nothing. His worldly possessions can be carried in one hand. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi is on a world odyssey. He carries a message that he says will rid the world of all unhappiness and discontent." The Maharishi's message grew wildly popular, in part because it was utterly wholesome. The Maharishi had a message of happiness, writing in 1967 that, quote, "Being happy is of the utmost importance. Success in anything is through happiness. Under all circumstances, be happy. Just think of any negativity that comes at you as a raindrop falling into the ocean of your bliss." The Maharishi preached that such happiness and higher levels of consciousness could be achieved through the practice of yoga and deep meditation several times a day. He especially encouraged mass meditation sessions, at times including thousands of people, which he believed could achieve literally world-changing results. The Maharishi achieved particular notoriety in 1968, when he became the spiritual advisor of a number of celebrities and rock musicians, such as the Beach Boys and the Beatles, who stayed with him in India starting in February 1968. The band members stayed with him for anywhere from 10 days to 6 months, and during sessions at the yogi's compound, they composed many songs that would later be released on albums like the White Album. Under his guidance, they disconnected from drugs like LSD and strived to achieve deeper awareness through meditation. He provided a calming, soothing message during a time when the band was struggling to keep things together. The stay was not without controversy. Rumors surfaced that during their visit, the Maharishi had made sexual advances towards the actress Mia Farrow, which caused dissension in the group. John Lennon later wrote the song "Sexy Sadie" about that episode. By the end of the year, the Beatles had disavowed their relationship with the Maharishi, though decades later, Paul McCartney visited with him again and restored their relationship. Unlike other cult leaders, the Maharishi was utterly humble, living an ascetic lifestyle and not accumulating any worldly possessions. He was genuine and likable, nicknamed the Giggling Guru for his propensity to laugh and giggle during interviews. He had no visible agenda beyond helping people achieve their dreams. At the same time, he was not without critics and skeptics. While he had no possessions, his organization did accumulate great wealth, and he left an inheritance of some $300 million to an inheritors. He also spent much of his life in the company of celebrities, and his doubters questioned the joy he seemed to take in being famous himself. However, unlike other cult leaders, he was never motivated by selfishness or greed, and he left a powerful legacy of the importance of meditation, a legacy that spiritual leaders and scientists have continued to study to this day. Scholars debate why the late 1960s were a time that seemed so ripe for alternative religions or cults. It seems obvious that there was some connection between the baby boomers coming of age in the midst of a time of such upheaval and violence. The Vietnam War, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and later the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy all contributed to feelings of angst and confusion with the teenagers of the 60s. While pushing away from their parents and rejecting their traditional beliefs, teenagers sought outlets in unconventional places. Certainly, the different, strange, and sometimes quirky or funny methods and messages of some of these cults must have appealed to the youth in America, certainly more than the stuffy and dull customs of the Catholic Church or many other Christian denominations. Young people of any generation are also more impressionable and prone to fall prey to the schemes of nefarious adults, and the push for independence of the 1960s only exacerbated that fact. Throw in the role that marijuana, LSD, and other drugs played in some of these movements, and some followers of these cults literally lost their minds in the process. Not all of the cults were bad or ended badly. Many incorporated messages of peace and love that Americans craved and were too often lacking in mainstream activities. Unfortunately, though, in cases like the Mansons and a number of the other groups, those messages became twisted into hatred and even violence, a feature of the 1960s that grew even more pronounced in the years after 1968.